You're sitting alone in your room. It's quiet. You're thinking about what to have for dinner, scrolling through your phone, when suddenly, a thought appears in your mind. But this thought feels different. It doesn't feel like your thought. It's in your head, yes. You can hear it clearly, more clearly than any external sound. But there's something fundamentally wrong. This thought, this voice, feels like it's coming from somewhere else. Someone else. It's not that you're imagining someone speaking to you. It's not a hallucination in the traditional sense. It's worse. This thought is in your mind, occupying the exact same mental space where your thoughts should be, but your brain is screaming at you, "This isn't mine. This doesn't belong to me. Someone put this here." Now imagine this happens again. And again. Every few minutes, thoughts that feel alien invade your consciousness. They comment on what you're doing. They criticize you. They tell you things you don't want to know. And no matter how hard you try to push them away, you can't, because they're already inside the most private space you have, your own mind. This isn't science fiction. This is a real neurological and psychiatric phenomenon called thought insertion, and it represents one of the most terrifying breakdowns of human consciousness possible. It's the moment when your brain stops recognizing your own thoughts as yours. When the fundamental boundary between self and other, the boundary that defines your very existence as a separate being, completely dissolves. But here's what makes this truly fascinating and deeply unsettling. If your brain can fail to recognize your own thoughts, what does that say about the nature of thoughts themselves? What creates that sense of ownership in the first place? And if that sense is just another brain process that can malfunction, who are you, really? Today, we're diving into the neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy of mental ownership. What happens when your mind becomes a stranger to itself? Let's find out. To understand how devastating thought insertion is, you first need to understand something you probably take completely for granted, the feeling that your thoughts are yours. Right now, as you're watching this, you're having thoughts. Maybe you're thinking about what I just said. Maybe you're wondering where this video is going. Maybe you're thinking about something completely unrelated, what you need to do later, a conversation you had yesterday, whether you're hungry. But here's the crucial part, you know these thoughts are yours. You don't question it. There's an immediate, automatic sense of ownership. These thoughts originated from within you. They're part of your internal monologue, your stream of consciousness, your mental life. They have a quality, philosophers call it mindness, that stamps them as belonging to you and no one else. This feeling is so fundamental, so automatic, that you've probably never questioned it. It's like asking a fish to notice water. The sense that your thoughts are your own is the foundation of your entire subjective experience. It's what makes you, you. Now imagine that foundation cracks. For people experiencing thought insertion, this basic sense of ownership disappears for certain thoughts. A thought appears in their consciousness, but it comes with a completely different quality. It feels imposed. Inserted. Placed there by an external force. One patient described it like this: "My thoughts are not my own. They are put into my mind by someone else. I don't know who, but they're using my brain to think their thoughts." Another said, "It's like someone is broadcasting into my head. The thoughts are there, in my mind, but they're not mine. I can tell the difference between my thoughts and their thoughts." Notice what's happening here. These individuals aren't hearing voices in the traditional sense. That's a different phenomenon called auditory hallucination. They're not experiencing thoughts and then attributing them to someone else after the fact. The very experience of the thought itself comes pre-labeled, so to speak, as not mine. The thought appears already wearing a foreign identity. This creates a psychological horror that's almost impossible to convey to someone who hasn't experienced it. Your mind, the most intimate, private space you have, has been invaded. But unlike a physical invasion, you can't run away. You can't lock the door. The invasion is happening in the only place you can never escape, inside your own consciousness. Think about that for a moment. Imagine you could never be alone with your own thoughts because your thoughts aren't reliably yours anymore. Every mental experience becomes suspect. Every time a thought appears, you have to wonder, is this me, or is this someone else using my brain? The paranoia this creates isn't irrational, it's the logical response to having your most basic cognitive boundary violated. If you can't trust that your thoughts are your own, what can you trust? But here's where this gets even more interesting and disturbing. Thought insertion isn't just random thoughts appearing. There's often a pattern. The inserted thoughts frequently comment on the person's actions, criticize them, or command them to do things. It's as if whatever force is inserting these thoughts has an agenda, a personality, a hostile intelligence. One patient reported, "I was making breakfast, and suddenly I thought, you're doing this wrong. You're pathetic. You can't even make eggs properly." But I knew immediately, I didn't think that. Someone else did. They put it in my head to hurt me. The content of inserted thoughts often reveals deep fears, shame, or anxiety. But the person experiencing them is adamant, these aren't repressed thoughts bubbling up from their unconscious. These aren't intrusive thoughts that they recognize as unwanted but still their own. These are thoughts that feel, from the first millisecond of their appearance, like they originated from outside. This raises a profound question: how does your brain normally create that sense of ownership? What is the mechanism that stamps a thought as mine versus not mine? Because here's the unsettling truth. There's nothing inherently yours about a thought. A thought is just neural activity, electrochemical signals firing across networks of neurons. The feeling that it's yours is a separate process, an additional layer of brain activity that gets added on. It's your brain tagging its own activity with a sense of ownership. And like any brain process, this tagging system can malfunction. When it does, you get thought insertion. The thought itself is generated by your brain, the neural activity is happening in your neurons, but the ownership signal fails to attach. Your brain generates the thought but doesn't recognize it as its own creation. It's like a factory that manufactures a product but then doesn't recognize it on the assembly line, treating it as if it came from somewhere else. This is what makes thought insertion so philosophically fascinating and existentially terrifying. It reveals that the sense of mental ownership, the thing that makes your mind feel like your mind, is not inherent to thoughts themselves. It's a constructed feeling, a brain-generated label. And labels can be applied incorrectly. Or not applied at all. So what happens when your brain stops applying this label correctly? What breaks in the neural machinery? And what does this breakdown reveal about the nature of consciousness, self, and identity? To answer these questions, we need to go deeper into the architecture of self. Your sense of self, that continuous feeling of being a unified you who persists through time, who owns your experiences, who authors your actions, is not a single thing. It's a construction. An ongoing performance by your brain, assembling a coherent sense of self from multiple subsystems and processes. Think of it like a movie. When you watch a film, you see continuous motion, people moving smoothly, stories unfolding. But that continuity is an illusion. The film is actually a series of still images flashing rapidly. Your brain constructs the experience of continuous motion from discrete frames. Your sense of self works similarly. There's no single self-center in your brain, no throne room where a little homunculus sits, watching your thoughts and claiming ownership. Instead, your brain runs multiple parallel processes that create different aspects of selfhood, and these are integrated into the unified experience of being you. One crucial aspect is agency, the sense that you're the author of your actions. When you decide to move your arm, there's a feeling that you initiated that movement. It's yours. You did it. Another aspect is mental ownership, the sense that your thoughts, feelings, and experiences belong to you. This is the layer that fails in thought insertion. A third aspect is narrative self, the story you tell about who you are, your memories, your personality, your goals. This gives you continuity over time. You're the same person who existed yesterday and who will exist tomorrow. All of these aspects rely on sophisticated neural mechanisms working in the background, constantly monitoring, predicting, and integrating information. And one of the most important mechanisms for mental ownership is something called corollary discharge or efference copy. Here's how it works. When your brain decides to do something, say, think a thought or move your arm, it doesn't just send a command to execute that action. It also sends a copy of that command to other parts of the brain, essentially saying, heads up, I'm about to do this. This copy is the efference copy or corollary discharge. This mechanism allows your brain to predict the sensory consequences of its own actions. When you move your arm, the corollary discharge allows your brain to predict what that movement will feel like and what you'll see. When you speak, it allows your brain to predict what your voice will sound like. And crucially, when you generate a thought, the corollary discharge allows your brain to tag that thought as self-generated. The thought arrives in consciousness already marked, I made this. This is why you can distinguish between thoughts you generate internally and perceptions that come from the external world. When you imagine a sound, you hear it in your head, and you know you imagined it. When you hear an actual sound, you know it came from outside. The corollary discharge mechanism is a big part of how your brain makes this distinction. But what if this mechanism fails? What if your brain generates a thought, neural activity fires, the thought appears in consciousness, but the corollary discharge doesn't happen, or doesn't get properly integrated? The thought appears, but without the tag saying I made this. Your brain looks at this thought and concludes, this didn't come from me. This must have been inserted from outside. This is the leading neuroscientific explanation for thought insertion in schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. It's not that external thoughts are actually being inserted, though that's what it feels like to the person experiencing it. It's that the brain's self-monitoring system is malfunctioning. The ownership tagging system is broken. Brain imaging studies support this. When people with schizophrenia experience thought insertion, researchers see abnormal activity in areas like the anterior cingulate cortex and the temporoparietal junction, regions involved in self-monitoring, agency detection, and distinguishing self from other. There's also evidence of disrupted connectivity between the brain regions that generate internal speech and the regions that monitor and tag it as self-generated. It's like a communication breakdown within the brain. One department is producing thoughts, but another department never gets the memo that these are internal productions, so it treats them as external inputs. This raises an unsettling implication. The difference between your thoughts and someone else's thoughts isn't in the thoughts themselves. It's in the metadata your brain attaches to them. It's in whether the self-monitoring system successfully tags them as self-generated. Change the tagging, and you change the ownership. The actual content of the thought can be identical, but it will feel either like yours or like an invasion, depending on whether that ownership tag gets applied. This means that the most private thing you think you have, your own mind, your own thoughts, isn't actually a secure, impenetrable fortress. It's a construct, maintained by neural mechanisms that can fail. And when they do fail, the boundary between self and world dissolves. Imagine living in that state. Every thought could potentially feel alien. You'd have no reliable boundary between what's you and what's not you. Your mind would become a contested space, a battlefield where you're constantly trying to determine what's legitimately yours and what's been inserted. This isn't just a medical curiosity. This is a window into how tenuous and constructed our entire sense of self really is. So what does it actually feel like when this system breaks down? Let's look at the lived experience. Sarah was 23 when it started. She was finishing her undergraduate degree, stressed about exams and her future, when one evening, alone in her apartment, she heard a thought that didn't feel like hers. Not a voice, exactly. Not someone speaking to her. It was a thought, in her own internal voice, but tagged with a foreign quality she couldn't explain. The thought said, "You're being watched." She froze. Where did that come from? She looked around her empty apartment. No one was there. She tried to dismiss it as anxiety, but the feeling was different from anxious thoughts she'd had before. This thought felt external. Like someone had reached into her mind and placed it there. Over the next few weeks, it happened more frequently. Thoughts would appear, critical thoughts, paranoid thoughts, sometimes just random observations, and each one felt distinctly not hers. she could tell the difference. Her own thoughts had a quality of familiarity, of continuity with her stream of consciousness. These inserted thoughts felt jarring, discontinuous, alien. It's like, she later told her psychiatrist, someone else is using my brain to think. I can feel their thoughts inside my head, but they're not mine. I don't know how I know, but I do. They're someone else's. Sarah was eventually diagnosed with early-stage schizophrenia, a condition where thought insertion is one of the hallmark symptoms. But calling it a symptom almost minimizes how existentially disruptive it is. Thought insertion doesn't just cause distress, it fundamentally destabilizes your sense of self. Because if you can't reliably claim ownership of your own mental states, what basis do you have for identity at all? Philosophers have long recognized that our mental lives are considered the most private and inalienable aspect of selfhood. Descartes famously argued, "I think, therefore I am." The one thing you can't doubt is that you're having experiences, including thoughts. Even if everything else is an illusion, your own mental states are directly and incorrigibly known to you. But thought insertion challenges this. People experiencing it will say, with absolute conviction, I am having a thought, but it's not my thought. They're conscious of the mental state, it's appearing in their awareness, but they deny ownership of it. This creates a bizarre philosophical puzzle. If you're aware of a thought, if it's in your consciousness, in what sense can it be not yours? The answer reveals something profound. There are layers to subjective experience. There's the content of the thought itself, and then there's the sense of ownership of that content. These are separable. You can have one without the other. In normal experience, these layers are seamlessly integrated. A thought appears, and it automatically feels like yours. You don't have to make a judgment or inference, the ownership is given directly in the experience itself. Phenomenologists call this pre-reflective self-awareness, a kind of immediate self-presence that accompanies all your experiences. But in thought insertion, this pre-reflective self-awareness gets detached from certain thoughts. The thought appears in consciousness, but the automatic sense of mindness doesn't attach. The result is an experience that's paradoxical from a normal perspective, a thought that's in your mind but not of your mind. For Sarah, this created a state of constant vigilance and terror. She couldn't trust her own mental life. Every thought had to be scrutinized. Is this me, or is this them? And here's the truly insidious part. The effort to distinguish her thoughts from inserted thoughts was itself exhausting and often futile. Because the inserted thoughts felt so genuinely external, she would sometimes take actions based on them, believing they were communications or commands from outside forces. One evening, she had the thought, go to the window and look outside. Someone needs help. The thought felt inserted, not hers, so she interpreted it as a genuine call for help, perhaps from a neighbor or a stranger. She rushed to the window, looked outside for 20 minutes, searching for someone in distress. No one was there. Later, she realized with horror, had that been her own thought, triggered by normal anxiety or concern, but misattributed to an external source? Or had it genuinely felt different? She couldn't tell anymore. The boundary was so corrupted that she was losing the ability to distinguish genuine self-generated thoughts from the ones that felt alien. This is the psychological vortex that thought insertion creates. It's not just that some thoughts feel foreign, it's that the criterion for distinguishing self from other becomes unreliable. You start second-guessing everything. You lose trust in your own mind. And the tragedy is that other people can't validate your experience. They can't look inside your head and confirm, yes, that thought is indeed foreign. From the outside, you're just someone claiming that thoughts are being inserted into your head, which sounds, to most people, like a clear delusion. But from the inside, it's not a delusion in the sense of a false belief. It's a malfunction of experience itself. The thought really does feel alien. The sense of ownership really is absent. You're reporting your phenomenology accurately. It's your brain's attribution system that's broken, not your honesty or perception. This makes thought insertion particularly isolating. You're experiencing something that violates the most basic assumption about consciousness, that your thoughts are your own, but no one else can access that experience or validate it. You're trapped in a reality that others can't enter or understand. Sarah, like many people with thought insertion, found temporary relief in antipsychotic medication, which helps restore normal neural signaling and reduce the malfunction in self-monitoring systems. But the experience left a permanent mark. Even now, she says, years later and in stable recovery, sometimes when I have a thought, there's a flicker of doubt. A tiny voice asking, "Is this mine?" It goes away quickly, but it's there. That doubt, that crack in the foundation, never fully heals. So what's actually happening in the brain when this system fails? To understand that, we need to explore the neuroscience of agency and mental ownership in more detail. Your brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. It's constantly generating models of the world and of your own body, making predictions about what will happen next, and then comparing those predictions to actual incoming sensory data. This process, called predictive processing or predictive coding, is now thought to be a fundamental principle of brain function. Here's a simple example. When you reach out to pick up a coffee cup, your brain predicts what that will feel like, the weight of the cup, the temperature, the texture. As you actually grasp it, sensory information flows back to your brain. Your brain compares the prediction to the actual sensory input. If they match, all is well. If they don't match, say, the cup is much heavier than expected, you get a prediction error, and your brain updates its model. This same prediction mechanism applies to mental actions, including thoughts. When you deliberately generate a thought, say, you consciously decide to think about what you're going to have for dinner, your brain makes a prediction, "I'm about to generate this thought." When the thought then appears in consciousness, your brain compares it to the prediction. Match. This is labeled as self-generated. The prediction is made by sending an efference copy, that corollary discharge we talked about earlier, from motor/executive areas to sensory/monitoring areas. This efference copy essentially says, "I'm initiating this action, expect these sensory consequences." In the case of thought and inner speech, the efference copy is sent from regions like Broca's area, involved in speech production, to regions like Wernicke's area and the superior temporal gyrus, involved in speech perception and monitoring. This allows your brain to distinguish between inner speech you're generating and external speech you're hearing. Studies using fMRI and other brain imaging techniques have found that people with schizophrenia who experience thought insertion show reduced activity in these self-monitoring regions when they generate inner speech. There's a disconnect. The production areas are active, but the monitoring areas don't receive the proper efference copy, or they fail to use it to tag the thought as self-generated. Additionally, there's abnormal activity in the temporoparietal junction, TPJ, a brain region heavily involved in distinguishing self from other. The TPJ integrates information about agency, perspective-taking, and theory of mind. When it malfunctions, the boundaries between self and other blur. There's also evidence of dysfunction in the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, which is involved in conflict monitoring and error detection. The ACC is supposed to detect when something is off, when predictions don't match reality, when there's conflict between different streams of information. In thought insertion, the ACC may be sending error signals, "This doesn't feel right, this doesn't match my predictions," but instead of updating the prediction model, the brain interprets the error as evidence that the thought came from outside. It's a bit like a false alarm system. The system detects a mismatch, a thought appeared without the proper self-generated tag, and instead of concluding "my tagging system is broken," it concludes "this must be an intruder." Interestingly, this mirrors other phenomena where agency and ownership become disrupted. Alien hand syndrome, a neurological condition where people feel like one of their hands is acting independently, not under their control. They'll say things like, "My hand is doing this, but I'm not doing it." Again, it's a breakdown in the sense of agency, where actions are produced by the motor system but don't get properly tagged as self-generated. Anarchic hand syndrome, similar to alien hand, but the person may even perceive the hand as having hostile intentions, actively working against them. Out-of-body experiences, where the sense of bodily self-location and first-person perspective becomes disrupted, often due to TPJ malfunction. People report feeling like they're observing themselves from outside their body. All of these conditions reveal the same underlying truth: The sense of ownership and agency, the feeling that your body is yours, that your actions are yours, that your thoughts are yours, is a constructed experience that depends on the proper functioning of specific brain networks. And these networks are more fragile than we'd like to believe. Research with transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, where scientists use magnetic pulses to temporarily disrupt brain activity in specific regions, has shown that you can experimentally reduce people's sense of agency. If you disrupt the TPJ or related regions at the right moment, people report feeling less certain that they caused an action they clearly did cause. The sense of authorship becomes fuzzy. This means that, in principle, we're all one minor brain malfunction away from experiencing thought insertion or related phenomena. The mechanisms that maintain your sense of self are robust, they work reliably for most people, most of the time, but they're not invulnerable. Drugs can also disrupt these mechanisms. Certain psychedelics, for example, are known to create experiences of ego-dissolution, where the boundary between self and world becomes permeable or disappears entirely. Users report thoughts arising without a clear sense of who's thinking them, or emerging with external reality where the distinction between internal and external breaks down. This isn't identical to thought insertion. Psychedelic users typically maintain some awareness that they've taken a drug and that their experience is altered, but it demonstrates that the neural machinery of self can be chemically modulated. The takeaway: your sense of mental ownership is not a magical property of consciousness. It's a biological process, implemented by specific brain circuits, using specific mechanisms like corollary discharge and predictive coding. And like any biological process, it can malfunction, degrade, or be manipulated. The clinical descriptions and neuroscience are important, but they can make thought insertion feel abstract, distant. To truly understand the lived reality, we need to hear from people who've experienced it. James, diagnosed with schizophrenia at age 28, described his first experience of thought insertion this way. I was sitting at my desk at work, doing something routine, entering data into a spreadsheet, when suddenly I had this thought: James is such a failure. James can't even do this simple task correctly. But immediately, I knew I didn't think that. The thought was about me, referring to me in third person, and it had a hostile quality that didn't match my actual feelings. I was having a normal day. I didn't feel like a failure. But this thought appeared, fully formed, and it felt like someone else observing me and commenting on me inside my own head. Notice the third-person perspective. This is common in thought insertion. The thoughts often refer to the person by name or in third person, which reinforces the feeling that they're external observations rather than self-generated thoughts. Maria, who experienced thought insertion during a psychotic episode triggered by extreme stress and sleep deprivation, described it like this. The thoughts came in a different voice. Not a voice I could hear with my ears, but my internal thoughts have a certain texture, I guess? A flow. These thoughts didn't have that. They felt sharp, intrusive, like they were injected. One moment my mind was quiet, the next moment there was this thought: they're going to hurt you. Not, I think they're going to hurt me. Just this declarative statement, appearing in my consciousness, but feeling like it came from outside. Like someone telepathically beaming it into my head. The terror in these descriptions is palpable. And it's compounded by the fact that the people experiencing it are often aware, on some level, that what's happening sounds impossible or delusional. They know that in the ordinary world, thoughts can't be inserted into minds. But the phenomenology, what it feels like, is so compelling that they can't shake the conviction that it's really happening. This creates a painful double consciousness. I know this sounds crazy, but I also know what I'm experiencing, and it really feels like my thoughts are not my own. David, who has recovered from a schizophrenic episode but still reflects on his experience of thought insertion, said, "The worst part wasn't even the content of the inserted thoughts, though they were often disturbing. The worst part was losing trust in my own mind. Every thought became suspect. I'd think, I should call my mom, and then immediately wonder, did I think that, or was that inserted to manipulate me? It was paralyzing. I couldn't make decisions because I didn't know if my thoughts were really mine. This paralysis is a common consequence. When you can't trust that your thoughts are yours, how do you make choices? How do you plan? How do you navigate the world? Your thoughts are supposed to be your guide, your tool for reasoning and deciding. But if they're unreliable, if they might be someone else's thoughts, then you're lost. And then there's the social dimension. People with thought insertion often believe that whoever is inserting thoughts can also read their thoughts, or that their thoughts are being broadcast to others. These related symptoms, thought withdrawal and thought broadcasting, compound the invasion of mental privacy. Imagine believing that every thought you have is potentially accessible to others, or that thoughts can be removed from your mind against your will. The mind, which should be your most private sanctuary, becomes a public space, or a space controlled by others. One patient described it as living in a glass house where everyone can see inside, and some people can even reach in and rearrange the furniture. The recovery process, when it happens, often involves medication, therapy, and slowly rebuilding trust in one's own mind. But many people report that even after the acute symptoms fade, there's a lingering fragility, a permanent awareness that the boundary between self and other, which most people never even notice, is not as solid as it seems. These stories aren't just medical case studies. They're profound existential testimonies. They show us what happens when the basic architecture of selfhood collapses. And they force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of consciousness and identity. Thought insertion doesn't just challenge psychiatry and neuroscience, it challenges philosophy itself. For centuries, philosophers have treated mental states as having a special, privileged status. You can be wrong about the external world, you might misperceive something, or be deceived, but you can't be wrong about your own experiences. If you feel pain, you're in pain. If you believe something, you believe it. This is called first-person authority or incorrigibility, the idea that you have special, unchallengeable access to your own mental states. But thought insertion complicates this. The person says, I'm experiencing a thought, but it's not my thought. Are they right? From one perspective, if they're experiencing it, it must be their thought, it's occurring in their brain, in their consciousness. From another perspective, if the phenomenology includes a sense of alienness, then maybe we need to respect their report and say, okay, there are thoughts in your consciousness that genuinely don't feel like yours. This forces us to distinguish between two things. Subjectivity, having a conscious experience. Ownership, feeling that the experience is yours. Normally these coincide perfectly. But thought insertion shows they can come apart. This has implications for theories of self. If selfhood is about ownership and authorship of mental states, and if those can be disrupted while the mental states continue, then maybe the self is not as unified or foundational as we thought. Maybe it's more like a claim that the brain makes, this is mine, rather than an inherent property. There's also a deep question about rationality. People experiencing thought insertion often have preserved rationality in other domains. They can reason, solve problems, have coherent conversations. They're not globally confused. But they hold a belief, thoughts are being inserted into my mind, that seems impossible. Are they irrational? Or are they being perfectly rational in responding to their phenomenology? If your experience genuinely includes thoughts that feel alien, isn't it rational to conclude that they're alien, even if that conclusion contradicts what neuroscience tells us about how brains work? Some philosophers argue that people with thought insertion are giving accurate reports of their experience, but drawing wrong conclusions about the cause. The thoughts really do feel alien, but the cause is internal brain malfunction, not external insertion. Others argue that the experience itself is malformed in a way that makes it impossible to report accurately. Then there's the question of mental privacy. Traditionally, the mind is considered the ultimate private space. But if you can have thoughts that don't feel like yours, that feel like invasions, then in what sense is your mind private? Even without actual telepathy or mind reading, the subjective experience of privacy has been violated. This connects to broader philosophical questions about the boundaries of the self. Where do you end and the world begin? Normally, the answer seems obvious, your body is the boundary, and your mind is entirely inside that boundary. But thought insertion shows that even internal experiences can feel external. Some philosophers, like Andy Clark and David Chalmers, have argued that the mind extends beyond the brain, that tools, environments, and even other people can become part of your cognitive system. If that's true, then boundaries are already fuzzy. Thought insertion might be an extreme case of boundary confusion, but maybe it reveals that boundaries were never as clear as we assumed. Finally, there's an existential dimension. If your sense of self is constructed, fragile, and can break down, what does that mean for how you should live? Should you be more humble about your self-knowledge? More compassionate toward people whose subjective experience is radically different from yours? Thought insertion is a window into the constructed nature of consciousness. It shows us that the things we take most for granted, that our thoughts are our own, that we know our own minds, that we have a stable self, are achievements of neural computation, not givens of existence. And achievements can fail. So, what happens if your brain stops recognizing your own thoughts as yours? You enter a state of profound existential crisis, where the most basic boundary, the boundary between self and world, dissolves. Your mind becomes a contested space, occupied by experiences that feel alien yet are inescapably present in your consciousness. You lose trust in the most private, intimate aspect of your existence, your own thoughts. But beyond the clinical and personal implications, thought insertion teaches us something fundamental about human consciousness. It reveals that the sense of ownership, the feeling that your experiences are yours, is not inherent to having experiences. It's an additional layer, a constructed quality that your brain adds through specific mechanisms like corollary discharge, predictive processing, and self-monitoring. These mechanisms usually work so seamlessly that we never notice them. But they can malfunction. And when they do, the illusion of simple, unified selfhood falls apart. This should give us pause. Every day, you have thousands of thoughts, and you immediately, effortlessly recognize all of them as yours. But that recognition is not a given. It's an accomplishment of your brain, a constant act of self-creation that you're not even aware is happening. You are not a fixed, solid self that has thoughts. You are a process, a continuous, dynamic construction project, where your brain is constantly generating experiences and tagging them as yours. The self is not a thing you have. It's something your brain does. And like any process, it can be disrupted. Thought insertion is an extreme case, but it represents a general truth. Consciousness is far stranger, more fragile, and more constructed than our everyday experience suggests. The things that feel most certain, I exist, I think, my thoughts are mine, are not absolute bedrock. They're conclusions your brain reaches, based on information it integrates. Change the information, disrupt the integration, and those certainties evaporate. So the next time you have a thought, take a moment to notice that sense of ownership, that immediate, automatic feeling that this thought is yours. It's easy to take for granted. But you're witnessing one of the most sophisticated pieces of neural engineering in the universe, the construction of self. And now you know just how fragile, and how precious, that construction really is. What thought will you have next? And how will you know it's really yours?